A thermal drone can detect a human body through 2 meters of dense forest canopy. It reads heat. Mine, yours, anyone's. It is a technology designed to make the invisible visible. May 2019, Hawaii. A fleet of military-grade drones equipped with FLIR technology scans 2,000 acres of forest in a grid so tight that the rescue coordinators call it a saturation map. They are looking for a single thermal signature. One warm body, alive, somewhere inside that perimeter. They find nothing. Despite 5,000 hours of searching and a community that refuses to give up. For 17 days, Amanda Eller remains invisible. She is inside the perimeter. She is inside the zone they have already swept. She is there, present. And yet, to the most sophisticated sensors in the world, she simply does not exist. She is not a ghost. She is an injured woman fighting for her life. Most people think this is just a survival story. But there is a detail buried in the search rescue logs that doesn't fit any official version of events. A detail that still drives the pilot who saved her to ask himself the same question years later. How is it possible? Makawa Forest Reserve, Maui, Hawaii. May 8th, 2019. Amanda Eller was 35 years old, a physical therapist, a yoga teacher, someone who lived in the kind of slow, deliberate alignment with her body that most people only talk about. She understood anatomy, movement, the limits of human endurance. She had hiked before. She was not reckless. She was not unprepared in the way that headlines would later suggest. She was simply a woman who wanted 2 hours in the forest, a 3-mile loop, fresh air before the week began. Her boyfriend left for work at approximately 7:30 that morning. She was meditating when he said goodbye. She drove herself to the Makawa Forest Reserve, parked her white Toyota RAV4 in the gravel lot near Hunter's Trail, and left her phone, her wallet, and her keys on the seat. It was a short hike. She didn't think she'd need them. The Makawa Forest Reserve sits in the uplands of North Maui, above the town of Haiku, where the elevation climbs and the air turns cool, and the eucalyptus grows so dense that daylight arrives in fragments. 2,093 acres of trails, ridgelines, gulches, stream systems, and ravines that descend without warning into darkness. It is not a wilderness for the unprepared. But it is popular. Families hike there. Mountain bikers ride those same trails on weekend mornings. On a Wednesday in May, with the sky wide and clear above Maui, it looked exactly like what it was, a beautiful place to spend a few hours alone. Amanda set off down the trail. At some point, she would say later that a kind of gut instinct pulled her. She stepped off the marked path and moved deeper into the forest. The trees closed behind her. She tried to find her way back to the trail. The trail didn't come. She walked further, certain she was heading in the right direction. The trail still didn't come. The whole time, she would later tell the New York Times, she was going deeper into the jungle, even though she was certain she was going back where she came from. The forest had accepted her, and the forest did not give directions. When she didn't come home that evening, her boyfriend waited. He checked the places she frequented. At 7:21 the following morning, May 9th, 2019, he called the Maui Police Department. Officers located her RAV4 still in the Hunter's Trail parking lot. Phone on the seat. Wallet on the seat. Keys on the seat. Amanda was not there. Police and fire personnel launched an initial search. 3 days. Standard procedure for a missing person on a known trail system. They found nothing. After 3 days, official resources were scaled back. That is when the community of Maui made a decision that would become remarkable. They didn't stop. They escalated. Chris Berquist was a volunteer coordinator with experience in EMS operations and cave rescues. He took charge of the search effort, set up a base camp inside the reserve, and began building what would become one of the most technologically sophisticated civilian search operations ever documented on American soil. He would lose his job over the next few days, fired by an employer frustrated with the time the search demanded. He kept going. Within a week, the search had its own saturation map, a real-time GPS tracking system that every volunteer logged into via smartphone, dropping pins to mark where they had been, flagging anything of interest. Red lines for tracking dogs, blue lines for volunteer searchers, green lines for drones. The map grew denser every day. The blank spaces shrank, and Amanda remained in the blank spaces. By day 4, inside the forest, Amanda had fallen 20 feet, off a cliff edge she hadn't seen until she was already over it. She broke the tibia in her left leg and damaged the meniscus in her knee. She could not walk. She crawled. She moved on her hands and her elbows, pulling herself forward across root systems and through ginger patches and over the kind of terrain that search volunteers later described as so rough, so full of downed trees and confusing false trails that even trained hikers had to be warned not to become victims themselves. On another night, a flash flood came without warning. The water rose fast. Rocks dug into her skin. She was certain the current would take her to the ocean. It was in that moment, she said later, that the only thing left available to her was to meditate. It was the only thing that brought her peace. She lost her shoes in the flood. She ate wild strawberry guavas, plants she couldn't identify, moths that landed on her body in the dark. She drank from the rivers. She slept in the mud to stay warm, pressed against the earth, covering herself in layers of fern. One night, she slept in the den of a wild boar that had already vacated. She lost 20 pounds. Her feet began to blister, then burn, then infect in ways that doctors would later describe as severe cellulitis, to the point where they genuinely considered amputation. And above her, every day, she could hear the helicopters. She could hear the rotors, that unmistakable mechanical rhythm cutting through the silence of the canopy. She would look up. She would scream. She would wave. The helicopters kept flying. On several occasions, she told ABC News she heard them pass directly overhead. And they didn't stop. Here's where the story stops being about survival and starts being about something else entirely. The FLIR, the forward-looking infrared system mounted on the search helicopters, is not a camera. It is a heat detector. The human body, alive and functioning, radiates thermal energy. Under normal forest conditions, that energy should cut through canopy like a signal through noise. The systems in use over Makawa were the same generation of technology used in law enforcement, in military operations, in wildfire suppression, designed to find human beings in dense terrain, designed specifically for situations like this. Amanda Eller was alive. She was warm. She was moving, at least partially, every day. She was inside the search perimeter. She was looking up at the helicopters. The thermal systems could not find her. Search coordinator Bergquist had been logging data obsessively for over 2 weeks. Every gulch checked, every cliff dropped, every pool system cleared. By day 12, volunteers had nearly saturated the initial 2-mile radius centered on the Hunter's Trail parking lot, all the way out to Awalau, all the way down the pond system. They were pushing further, into rougher terrain, into areas Bergquist himself said he wouldn't ask regular volunteers to enter. The drone operators, FAA certified, flying coordinated grid patterns, feeding footage back to base camp within the hour, logged green lines across every accessible quadrant. The blank spaces on the saturation map kept shrinking. Amanda stayed in the blank spaces. But there's a detail in those search logs that reframes everything. Amanda Eller was found approximately 4 miles from where her car was parked. 4 miles, with a broken leg, crawling, over 17 days. That number, 4 miles, sits at the outer edge of what the search parameters had been designed to cover. She had moved, slowly, relentlessly, in pain that most people cannot imagine, into territory that volunteers were only beginning to push into during the final days of the search. But here is the thing that Bergquist himself could not fully explain afterward. The area near the Kailua Reservoir in East Maui, where she was ultimately located, the creek bed between 2 waterfalls, had been within the extended search zone. Drones had flown that region. The FLIR had passed over. She was there, in the water, waving. And she hadn't been detected. She later described the moment the helicopter finally appeared above her and actually stopped. She looked up as they flew away after the rescue and watched the area where she had been disappear almost instantly into the canopy. "You couldn't make out heads or tails of where I was," she said. "It was just a needle in a haystack situation." A needle in a haystack. That is how the woman who survived describes being inside a forest while a thermal drone looked for her warmth. But the question Bergquist and pilot Pete Voorhes have never been able to fully answer is not how she survived. It is how she remained undetected. Not for an hour, not for a day, for 17. The forest at Makawa is not a simple thing. It is not the kind of place that cooperates with maps. Its canopy is dense enough that even midday sun arrives at ground level as scattered fragments, green filtered and directionless. Its ravines, the deep gulches that cut through the reserve like old wounds, create acoustic pockets where sound doesn't behave normally. A person shouting from inside a gulch might be inaudible to someone standing 30 meters above on the rim. The terrain swallows noise the way it swallows heat, the way it swallows people, selectively and without explanation. Rappeller Elena Prey, who volunteered for nearly the entire search effort, described the terrain as rough in a way that defied standard search methodology. Trees down, confusing side trails that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Stream systems that changed character. After rain, pools appearing and disappearing, ginger growing so thick in certain corridors that even a standing adult could vanish from view at a distance of 10 feet. The thermal problem goes deeper than canopy. Amanda Eller spent her days submerged, partially or fully, in the cold water of stream beds and pools. She drank from those rivers. She rested in them. She pressed herself against their banks for relief from sunburn, for cooling when the heat became unbearable, for the elementary survival logic that says, stay near water and you stay alive. Cold water, run long over volcanic rock at the bottom of a deep ravine, surrounded by dense canopy overhead. The same conditions that would suppress a human thermal signature to near ambient temperatures. The same conditions that would make a woman with a broken leg essentially invisible to a heat-sensing instrument passing overhead. She didn't plan it. She didn't understand she was doing it. She was simply following the most basic instinct available to her: survive. And in surviving, she became, thermally and spatially, a ghost. Day 14 was the darkest. Amanda herself identified it later. She had been lying near a waterfall, injured and exhausted, for 2 weeks. She could hear the helicopters circling. She looked up at the sky and felt, for the first time, truly invisible. Not just lost, not just alone. Invisible in a way that felt complete and permanent. She said she looked at the sky and whispered something that sounded like a surrender, not to the forest, to herself, a mercy, a request to be picked up. She said she had learned everything she was there to learn. Then she started walking down the waterfall, crawling, technically, but moving, choosing forward. Because the alternative was something she refused to name. On the afternoon of May 24th, 2019, day 17, the fuel on the search helicopter was getting low. Bergquist, Cantelops, and Helmer were scanning the forest from about 150 feet above the canopy, over roaring waterfalls and jagged cliff edges. They had been in the air for hours. They had a few minutes of fuel left. They decided to fly one final loop outside the primary, designated search zone over territory near the Kailua Reservoir in East Maui, an area researchers had flagged as a possible waterfall refuge based on probability modeling. In a flash of human presence among the branches, Bergquist saw a figure. Faded yoga pants, a dirtied white shirt, bare feet, standing in a creek bed, waving. They had studied her face for days. They had memorized it from photographs. Bergquist said there was no mistake, even from 200 feet. He said Cantelops nearly jumped from that height. The reward money had been raised to $50,000 that same morning, just hours earlier. Nobody was thinking about the money. She was airlifted to Maui Memorial Medical Center. Broken tibia, torn meniscus, severe burns across both feet. Cellulitis so advanced that doctors had seriously discussed amputation. 20 pounds lost. Dehydration. Skin damage from head to toe. She spent one night in the hospital. Just one. And at a press conference 3 days after her rescue, she stood in front of cameras and said the experience had been, among other things, deeply spiritual. That statement ignited a controversy that followed her for years. Speculation ran wild. Accusations circulated. How could someone emerge from 17 days of crawling through a forest on a broken leg and describe it with anything other than horror? Amanda addressed it plainly. She had never said it was easy. She had never said it didn't hurt. She said it changed her completely. She said going back to normal wasn't possible after something like that. She was right. But the controversy also did something else. It drew attention toward her mental state and away from the question that actually doesn't have an answer. Not why she was calm when she was found, but how she remained unfindable inside a perimeter for 17 days by technology that is designed to locate human beings in exactly these conditions. Let's be precise about what we know. The FLIR system used on the search helicopters is a forward-looking infrared imager. It reads radiated thermal energy. The human body produces a core temperature of approximately 37 degrees Celsius, generating a thermal contrast against forest background that is, under standard conditions, detectable at several hundred meters. The forests of Maui, however, are not standard conditions. They are equatorial rainforest terrain, warm and humid, with ambient ground temperatures that reduce thermal contrast significantly. Add a canopy layer of eucalyptus, an endemic Hawaiian species whose dense foliage absorbs and re-radiates heat, and the contrast narrows further. Add the cold stream water in which Amanda was regularly submerged, cooling her surface temperature to near ambient levels, and a FLIR system looking for a thermal signature might, in specific conditions, find nothing at all. This is not mystical, it is physics. But it is physics that collided, specifically and almost improbably, with every choice Amanda made in order to stay alive. She stayed near water because water was how she survived. She stayed in ravines because ravines were how she moved. She stayed in the low places of the forest because the low places were the only places she could reach on a broken leg. Every survival decision she made was simultaneously a decision that suppressed her thermal visibility. As if the forest had arranged the two things, survival and invisibility, to be the same thing. Amanda's father, John Eller, was the chief executive of a telematics company. He arrived on Maui early in the search and introduced a GPS tracking interface that transformed the operation, allowing volunteers to log their positions in real time, updating the saturation map every 5 minutes. He pulled the forensics data from Amanda's phone with the help of the Maui Police Department. There was no GPS track. She had been running no apps. All privacy settings had been disabled. The phone held nothing useful. They even attempted to extract GPS data from the infotainment unit in her car. The trail simply was not there. No digital footprint, no thermal footprint, no physical trail that the dogs could hold. In the language of search and rescue, Amanda Eller left no evidence of her own existence. She moved through 2,093 acres of mapped terrain, cataloged and gridded and saturated by technology and human effort, and left nothing behind that any system could follow. There is a word that helicopter pilot Pete Voorhis used when journalists asked him, a year later, what he thought had happened. He said he knew the end of the story. She was lost. They hadn't seen her. But the beginning of the story, he said, and he chose this phrasing deliberately, the beginning of the story he didn't know. A veteran pilot, a man who still receives texts and messages about this case years later. A man who found her, personally, from a helicopter, with his own eyes. And the beginning of the story, he doesn't know. There are rational frameworks for understanding what happened. Thermal suppression via water immersion is real and documented. Dense, canopy interference with FLIR imagery is a known limitation of the technology. Search dogs operating in the warm, wet environment of a Hawaiian rainforest face olfactory conditions that are among the most difficult on Earth. High humidity, cross-running water, strong competing organic scents from dense tropical vegetation. None of these explanations invalidate the search effort. The search effort was extraordinary. It was one of the most well-organized volunteer operations in American SAR history. And it still failed, technically, to locate its subject. She was found on a final, fuel-depleted loop outside the primary search zone by human eyes, by chance, by the stubborn refusal to turn back until the fuel ran out. But the rational frameworks also leave a residue of something that doesn't dissolve cleanly. The search was not passive. It was aggressive, systematic, and exhaustive. The technology used was the best available. The human effort was unprecedented. And the woman they were looking for was alive, present, waving at helicopters that flew directly above her for 2.5 weeks. That combination of facts, verified, documented, undisputed, does not resolve into a simple story about thermal physics and dense canopy. It resolves into a question. A quiet, persistent question that sits at the intersection of science and something that science doesn't have language for yet. Not a supernatural question, not an accusation, not a conspiracy. Just a question about the nature of certain spaces, certain terrain, certain forests. About whether some places on this earth have a relationship with human visibility that we don't fully understand. About whether a 2,093-acre reserve in the uplands of Maui, ancient and indifferent, operating by its own rules, can hold a person in its interior, alive, warm, present, and offer her to the instruments of modern search and rescue as simply nothing. Amanda Eller now lives off the island. She revisited the Makawa Forest Reserve for the first time in December 2020, nearly a year and a half after her rescue, as a form of exposure therapy. She stayed on the main trail. She brought her phone. She brought a kit her father had assembled. Whistle, emergency blanket, glow stick, a laminated card with instructions for what to do if you get lost. She said nothing has been the same since, that there is no going back to normal, that something in those 17 days broke things down and rebuilt them differently. The forest doesn't have a comment. Forests don't. The eucalyptus and the ginger and the cold water of those ravines have been there far longer than any of us will be. They were there before the trails were marked. They were there before the reserve had a name. They will be there long after every search helicopter and thermal drone is rust and memory. Every year, hikers park their cars in the gravel lot near Hunter's Trail. They check the map. They check the weather. They take photographs with their phones and start down the trail toward the eucalyptus. And the forest watches them with the patient, complete indifference of something that has seen all of this before, that has swallowed people and returned them changed, or not returned them at all. Without explanation, without apology, without a single adjustment to its surface. The search logs from 2019 are still out there. The saturation maps, the GPS coordinates, the drone flight paths, the thermal scan records. All of them showing in meticulous detail where the search went, where the lines were drawn, where the technology reached. And somewhere in those thousands of logged hours, inside that grid of red and blue and green lines, there is a blank space. A small, impossible blank space. 4 miles from the parking lot, in a creek bed between two waterfalls, where a woman with a broken leg spent 17 days waving at the sky. Amanda survived because she became invisible. She became invisible because she chose water over high ground, ravines over ridges, the cold and the dark over the exposed and the visible. She became invisible because the same forest that took her sense of direction also, somehow, absorbed her heat signature. She became invisible the way certain people become invisible in certain places, not through intention, not through any act of concealment, but through a precise alignment of circumstance and terrain and the particular indifference of a landscape that does not recognize human urgency, that does not organize itself around our need to find and be found. Amanda was a thermal ghost in a living forest. Present everywhere, visible nowhere, and the forest kept its secret for 17 days with the ease of something that has never needed to try. But consider this. Amanda's invisibility was imposed on her by the forest, by physics, by the desperate logic of staying alive in a place that did not want to release her. She was a ghost against her will. She wanted to be found. She screamed at every helicopter. She waved until her arms gave out. What happens then when the blind spot isn't the forest? What happens when the person who cannot be found is not fighting the invisibility, but living inside it, not for 17 days, but for an entire month? And the thing that makes them impossible to locate isn't thermal physics or dense canopy. What happens when the blind spot is something else entirely? That is the next case, and it will challenge every assumption this one left you with.